The most profound spiritual initiation available to modern humans isn't found in ancient temples or exotic ceremonies. It's waiting in the simple decision to choose marriage over romance, commitment over conquest, and the death of the separate self over the illusion of individual completion. This isn't about finding your other half or discovering your soulmate, concepts that Joseph Campbell would have recognized as beautiful but ultimately incomplete understandings of what sacred union actually offers the human soul. True marriage, in the mythological sense, is nothing less than a voluntary descent into the underworld of your own ego, with another person as both witness and fellow traveler, for the purpose of emerging as something neither of you could have become alone. Most people approach marriage as an extension of dating, a deeper commitment to someone who makes them happy, validates their choices, and fits comfortably into their existing life story. But Campbell understood that this kind of arrangement, however pleasant, remains fundamentally transactional. Real marriage, the kind that appears in myths across every culture, as the sacred union or hieros gamos, requires something far more demanding and infinitely more transformative: the willingness to let your individual identity die so that something larger can be born through your union. When Campbell spoke of marriage as an ordeal, he wasn't being pessimistic about love. He was acknowledging the profoundly initiatory nature of what happens when two people commit to staying together, not just through good times, but through the inevitable process of mutual disillusionment that reveals who each person really is beneath their carefully constructed personas. The romantic phase of any relationship is like the hero's ordinary world, comfortable, familiar, and ultimately limited. The real adventure begins when romance ends and marriage begins, when you discover that the person you've chosen to love is not the projection of your needs and fantasies, but a complete mystery who will spend the rest of your life revealing aspects of yourself you never knew existed. This is where marriage becomes a rite of passage in the deepest sense, not just a social ceremony marking a change in legal status, but an actual death and rebirth experience. The person who enters marriage and the person who emerges from truly engaging with its demands are not the same being. Something in you must die, the part that believed you could remain complete unto yourself, the part that wanted love to be comfortable rather than transformative, the part that sought relationship as a place to hide from your own growing edges rather than a crucible for discovering them. Ancient myths are filled with stories of divine unions that create new worlds, heroes who must marry the goddess to claim their kingdom, and lovers whose willingness to sacrifice everything for each other generates the power to transform not just themselves, but their entire community. These aren't quaint stories about ancient beliefs. They're archetypal maps of what becomes possible when two people approach their union as something sacred rather than simply personal, as a spiritual practice rather than just an emotional arrangement. Campbell identified the call to adventure as the moment when the hero's ordinary life is disrupted by an invitation to something larger, and in the context of marriage, this call rarely arrives as we might expect. It doesn't come in the form of finding the perfect person who fits seamlessly into your existing dreams and plans. Instead, it often appears as the bewildering recognition that you're drawn to someone who challenges your assumptions, mirrors your shadows, and somehow calls forth aspects of yourself that you've kept hidden even from your own awareness. The call to sacred marriage is the call to use your most intimate relationship as a vehicle for the kind of transformation that mystics once sought through years of solitary practice. It's the invitation to discover whether you have the courage to love someone not for how they make you feel about yourself, but for who they actually are, including the parts that trigger your deepest insecurities and reveal your most carefully guarded limitations. This kind of love requires what Campbell called the crossing of the threshold, the moment when you commit to staying present, even when everything in you wants to flee back to the safety of your separate self. Most people resist this call because they've confused love with compatibility, partnership with comfort, and commitment with security. But mythological marriage asks for something far more demanding: the willingness to let your relationship become a conscious collaboration in mutual awakening. This means agreeing to stay curious about each other rather than assuming you know who your partner is. It means choosing growth over comfort when those two impulses conflict. Most challenging of all, it means taking responsibility for your own emotional responses, instead of making your partner responsible for managing your inner state. The threshold guardians in this particular hero's journey are not external obstacles but internal resistances, the parts of you that want to remain unchanged, that prefer projection to self-awareness, that would rather be right than be in relationship. Every marriage faces moments when these guardians appear in full force, during conflicts that reveal fundamental differences in values, through life transitions that require renegotiation of roles and expectations, in the gradual process of seeing your partner clearly, rather than through the lens of your own needs and fears. What Campbell understood is that these challenges aren't obstacles to overcome, but invitations to transformation. Each crisis in a marriage, whether it's a disagreement about money, conflicting approaches to parenting, or the simple daily friction of two different nervous systems learning to coexist, offers an opportunity to practice the kind of ego death and rebirth that mystics have always recognized as the essence of spiritual development. The difference is that in marriage, this process happens not in isolation but in relationship, not through withdrawal from the world, but through deeper engagement with another human being. If you've ever sensed that your most intimate relationships could be vehicles for something deeper than personal happiness, if you felt called to approach love as a spiritual practice rather than just an emotional experience, you're recognizing the ancient wisdom that Campbell spent his life illuminating. Share your own insights about relationships as spiritual paths in the comments below. Subscribe to join a community, exploring how timeless mythological patterns can guide our modern quest for authentic connection and mutual transformation. The trials that Campbell wrote about, the tests, allies, and enemies that every hero must face, reveal themselves in marriage through the complex process of two people learning to create something together that neither could create alone. The greatest trial is not external conflict, but the internal challenge of remaining committed to growth when growth feels uncomfortable, staying open when your instinct is to protect, and choosing love when love requires letting go of being right, being comfortable, or being in control. Campbell often spoke of the sacred marriage as an alchemical process, and anyone who has been married for more than a few years understands this metaphor intimately. Like the ancient alchemists who sought to transform base metals into gold, marriage offers the opportunity to transform the raw material of human personality, with all its fears, defenses, and unconscious patterns, into something far more refined and conscious. But this transformation requires what the alchemists called the nigredo, the darkening phase where everything you thought you knew about yourself and your partner gets dissolved before something new can emerge. The beauty of this process, and what makes it genuinely initiatory, is that it can't be accomplished through willpower or technique alone. You can't force yourself or your partner to grow, can't manipulate the timeline of transformation, can't control the specific ways that your union will change both of you. What you can do is show up consistently, stay curious rather than defensive, and trust that the relationship itself has a wisdom that exceeds your individual understanding of what should happen or how it should unfold. This is where marriage becomes genuinely mythological, when you begin to experience your relationship as something larger than the sum of its parts, something that seems to have its own intelligence and direction. Campbell called this the meeting with the goddess, not necessarily a feminine figure, but the encounter with a wisdom that transcends your personal ego and invites you into a larger way of being. In marriage, this goddess appears as the relationship itself when it's functioning at its highest potential, generous, creative, transformative, and mysteriously capable of calling forth the best in both partners. The trials of this phase often involve learning to distinguish between the voice of your individual ego, which wants safety, validation, and control, and the voice of the relationship, which calls for risk, authenticity, and surrender. Every long-term partnership goes through periods when these voices are in direct conflict, when staying together requires one or both partners to grow in ways that feel uncomfortable, when love demands honesty that might threaten the illusion of compatibility, when commitment means choosing the health of the relationship over the preferences of your separate self. What makes this genuinely heroic is that you can't know in advance where this process will lead. Like all real initiations, marriage asks you to trust a transformation you can't control or predict. You enter as two individuals seeking happiness and discover yourselves becoming something unprecedented, not just a couple, but a creative partnership capable of contributing something unique to the larger human story. If you recognize your own relationship journey, in this description of marriage as mutual initiation, you're participating in one of humanity's oldest and most profound spiritual practices. Share how your partnership has challenged and transformed you. Your story might illuminate the path for others who are navigating their own alchemical process. Subscribe to continue exploring how ancient wisdom can guide modern relationships toward their deepest potential. The final stage of Campbell's hero's journey, the return with the elixir, takes on profound meaning in the context of marriage, when you realize that the treasure you've discovered isn't just personal happiness or even individual growth, but a completely new way of being human. You don't emerge from the trials of sacred marriage as a better version of your old self. You emerge as someone who has learned to love beyond the boundaries of personal preference, to create beyond the limitations of individual capacity, and to serve something larger than your own needs without losing touch with your authentic nature. This is what Campbell meant when he described true marriage as the sacrifice of the ego to the relationship, not the destruction of individuality, but its transformation into something more spacious and generous. You discover that you can remain completely yourself while simultaneously being part of something that transcends your separate identity. The paradox of mature marriage is that the more fully you surrender to the relationship, the more authentically individual you become, because you're no longer using energy to defend a false self or maintain an image. The elixir that you bring back from this journey is the lived understanding that love is not primarily an emotion, but a creative force, the same force that myths describe as bringing worlds into being. When two people learn to love each other, not for who they think the other person should be, but for who they actually are in each moment, including their capacity for growth and change, they become conduits for this creative power. Their relationship becomes a source of renewal not just for themselves but for everyone whose life they touch. This is why Campbell insisted that marriage, when approached as a spiritual practice rather than just a personal arrangement, serves a social function that extends far beyond the couple involved. A marriage that has successfully navigated the trials of mutual transformation becomes a living demonstration that human beings are capable of loving beyond their conditioning, creating beyond their limitations, and serving something larger than their individual survival. It becomes what mythologists call a axis mundi, a connection point between different levels of reality that makes healing and renewal available to the broader community. Living this way requires the integration of everything you've learned through the trials of relationship, the ability to stay present during conflict, to remain curious about your partner's inner world, to take responsibility for your own emotional responses, and to trust the wisdom of the relationship itself, even when you can't see where it's leading. Most importantly, it requires the ongoing willingness to choose love over being right, growth over comfort, and service over personal preference. The marriage that began as two people seeking happiness evolves into something far more meaningful, a conscious partnership in mutual awakening, a creative collaboration that serves the evolution of consciousness itself. This is not the end of the journey, but its true beginning. The moment when you realize that your most intimate relationship is also your most profound spiritual practice, and that learning to love one human being completely is inseparable from learning to love life itself.